2 weeks ago, we started a series that we're going to be doing this summer in a study of the parables of Jesus. And we started in Matthew chapter 13, and we're now going to jump over to Luke chapter 15 in a parable that will align perfectly for the day that we celebrate as a culture, Fathers, because there is a parable that Jesus tells to explain to us the heart of God through the story of a father and his sons. And that is a story that we find in Luke chapter 15. And in Luke chapter 15, the context is really set in the beginning of the chapter. So before we dive into the telling of the story of this father and his two sons, let's start in verse 1 for our scripture reading. It says, "Then all the tax collectors and sinners drew near to him, and the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' So he spoke with them this parable, saying," and we're going to look specifically at the parable of the father and his sons, often called the parable of the prodigal son or the lost son. And to lead up to that, Jesus tells two previous parables that are in line with the same theme in a response to the context of him receiving sinners and the Pharisees complaining. He starts by saying there was a shepherd who lost a sheep. And of the day, you would understand that when a shepherd loses a sheep, it's his job to recover that which was lost, even at the risk of the 99 who aren't lost. And so he tells that story. And then he tells another story and says there's a woman who loses a coin. It's a very valuable piece of her livelihood, so she looks throughout her whole house for it. Meaning that when you lose something, you have to go find it. If you lose something that it's your job to care for, if you lose something that's part of your livelihood, it makes sense that you would look for it. And it is with those two parables that Jesus will then give the most emphasized version of something that is valuable. It's a parable of a father and the value. How much more would a father value sons compared to a lost sheep or a lost coin? This is the one that gives the biggest emphasis of when something is lost that is loved or valuable, it is only right that it should be found by the person who oversees it and loves it. And it is that what we will study this morning. And before we look into it, I want to remind you something that is serving as a theme in our study of the parables. It was really brought out in Matthew chapter 13 last week. It's when we get an answer as to why Jesus speaks in parables. Remember, parables being stories or analogies, metaphor, that are given to explain things about the kingdom that are different than just direct teachings. What we don't find in Luke 15 or in Matthew 13 is Jesus rebuking people who complain against him. He doesn't just give them these simple answers as to why they are wrong. He gives them stories. Why? Well, in Matthew chapter 13, it says that he told parables so that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, "I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world." There are certain ways that Jesus teaches so that you actually have to really listen and really want to know. And in story form, he is teaching us secrets revealed through the analogy and the metaphor that were always there, but that will be mysterious upon hearing unless you go deeper into the story. And so in each study of our parables, we're also unlocking a secret or a mystery that's laid in the foundation of God's creation about his kingdom unfolds. The parable of the sower, the secret being that the word will go out and not everyone will respond and receive it and grow. That's mysterious. And the parable of the wheat and the tares is that there is a harvest at the end of the age that is coming, and until that harvest, God patiently waits and does not remove the weeds in his kingdom. How mysterious of him to do it that way. And for the answers to those mysteries, I refer back to last week and the week before's teaching. What is the mystery that we will find in the parable of the father and the son? So let's look into this now in verse 11. Jesus, now teaching in response to the complaining of how he receives sinners, says, "A certain man had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. The first way that this begins to set the stage is by describing what will be a direct relation to the heart of God into the heart of a father. And one of the mysteries that will be revealed in the telling of this story to the audiences that are listening is, who is God, really? Who is God? How does God receive people? How does God welcome people into his kingdom? And to begin to explain this, he says there's a father with two sons. And we look at the first son, who's actually the younger son, who's introduced first, and it says that he wants all of his inheritance. And I find it interesting that Jesus, in his day, was dead accurate in what we know about birth order dynamic, or what a lot of times can be stereotyped in old children versus young children, or firstborn versus the younger born. Have you ever noticed, and it will play out perfectly in this story, that oftentimes the birth order dynamic unfolds this way? The oldest loves the rules. They love to color inside the lines. They love to be good listeners. They love to reinforce the rules on your behalf as a father or mother in their family. I know this is true as I watch my oldest daughter. As I put her down to bed at night, she loves that final stage in our bedtime routine where I go through the rules of what now they must do once I leave the room. There will be no talking. Mouths have to stay closed. There will be no wiggling, something I had to introduce later. There'll be no, you can't sit up, you can't sing, the lights go out, and you have to close your eyes. And sometimes I'll leave and she'll say, Dad, don't forget the rules, because she thrives and loves the rules. And then there is, in that birth order dynamic, have you ever noticed that sometimes the youngest child is the exact opposite of that? Instead of loving rules, they love to party. They love the excitement of adventure. And rules are kind of a formality on their way to really the fun things of exploring life. I was explaining how that also plays out with my two daughters. My second born, if you've met her, she is in all attempts the life of the party. And I was explaining little ways that plays out. But lo and behold, after service last night, she ran down totally unplanned with her dress on top of her head, like a headdress. And she's running in circles down the aisle. And for anyone who was left over, I said, yeah, that's the second born right there. And you may see that. Now remember those stereotypes as you see them play out, because it is with those two extremes that Jesus is going to explain the love of a father. The youngest son, the younger of the two in that dynamic of birth order, is going to come to basically request for himself to be the ruler of his own life and to do what he wants, to not really pay attention to the rules. We know that because it says, and the younger of them said to his father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. In other words, I'd like my inheritance now. I don't care about tradition or the way that things should unfold. I want what is going to come to me when you die. I'd like it now. And he has a certain plan at how he wants to live that out. And for this, as we begin to ask the question, who is God? One of the mysteries that will be revealed to the audience of this day that we need constant reminder of is that Jesus is going to give the example of the heart of God through a father. And that might be difficult for some of you to hear, because sometimes we think of fathers as strict and distant and cold, but that's not any different from this day. So he's giving a picture of a very unique father. He's going to give a picture of a father who is so uniquely and unconditionally and lavishly loving to his children. That is something of a mystery that is unlocked in the telling of this story, that in this day it would be shocking for a younger son who has very little rights to inheritance at all to demand them even before the father dies. Commentators say that's like saying, you are dead to me now. And the response of the father is equally shocking. What does he do? It says, so he divided all of his livelihood and gave it to him. This is a picture of a father who freely gives, no questions asked, freely gives whatever the younger son wants. He divides his livelihood as if he was dead. He is being rejected, and yet he still freely gives. Now, this parable, for the first time in the study of our parables, will not have a direct telling of what each character means in a later teaching of Jesus to his disciples in an intimate setting. So we need to fill in some of the blanks here. The Father is the representation of the heart of God to the world. The younger son is now being a representation to those sinners and tax collectors that Jesus receives. He's dining with them. His reputation is that he ate with all sorts of younger sons. And the reason I point that out now is because we must remember that the complaints that were being waged against Jesus by the religious people is that he's just receiving these sinners and tax collectors. Jesus never allowed people to just sit right where they were at. He received them and he welcomed them in, but he had a message for them. In the telling of this story, the younger son is going to be a category that the sinners and the tax collectors will fall into, and he explains to them that the Father freely gives, that freely loves, lavishly gives in that category of people, but then he also builds in a warning to this. And this is what he says. In verse 14, it says, when he had spent all that he had, when the younger son who got his inheritance in a breaking of the rules, a breaking of the law, it said, when he had spent all that he had, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of the country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. Jesus, a warning for anyone that you are welcomed in, received by Christ. But remember that as much as the Father freely gives you your life, even if you don't believe in God, even if you don't want to align yourself with the perfect will of God in your life, you have lived your life according to what you want to freely receive your life and your gifts and your talents, and you want to live it out however you want. God is so giving, he will freely give you your life. He will allow you in free will to choose your plans and use your resources however you want. He causes, to use a verse that will be fitting for the morning, the rain to fall on the good and the unjust, equally giving air in our lungs, equally giving life to all that he has created. And yet there is a warning for any one of us who thinks that you will be openly received by Christ to do whatever you want. You're never supposed to live there. You're never supposed to stay as someone who takes and lavishly lives your life, because there will be a day when you spend all that you have. There will be a day when you take from God and you treat him as if the stuff that he has for you is more important than he is, and you will find yourself in a famined land. And you will come to a place in your life where you realize, and we pray that you come to this sooner than later, you realize that to take the resources of God and the life that God gives you and try to live out a life according to your plans, to go off to a distant land and to lavishly or prodigally spend your life however you want, the warning is that the famine is coming and the money will run out. And you will have to go to plan B to try to make it work, and you will find yourself in a deeper pit still, and then plan C, and then plan D. And this is not only a story about who God is, the loving heart of a father representing the heart of God. This is also a story about how to come back home. What is required of all of us to be received by God? That is the question of the hour, because Jesus receives these second sons. And there's complaints waged against him. What does it mean to be received back home? There's a question we're learning here of who is God. He is a loving and freely giving God. The second question is, who is worthy of that love? Who is worthy of the loving Father's unconditional love? And this is now where the story will turn. Jesus is going to give an answer to those who complain against him, to answer the question, who is worthy? And those are the two questions of your soul, whether you know it or not. Who is God? And how can I make right with him? So here's the beginning of the answer. Verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. This is the beginning of the journey back to God, and this is built into this. There is a plan that he has now of retribution. His first plan was to live his life however he wanted, and he found famine and want, and it didn't work. And now the question that he's trying to answer is, what would it take to get back into my father's house? And what does he say? It is the common thread built into all of the default thinking of our minds when it comes to how to be made right with God. I'm not worthy. Maybe I could be a servant. I could never be a son ever again. But maybe I could work my way back to the Father. Maybe I could do something to be a hired hand in the kingdom of my Father so that I could work my way back. And that is the beginning of the wrong answer of who is worthy. That's not the answer that Jesus gives, and it is radical in his day, and it's radical now for those of us who identify as the second son, lived a life in pursuit of self-discovery. We have found ourselves in want and in a famine land, and we have come here feeling far off. Here is the answer as to why this is maybe the most important parable that Jesus ever tells, because he radically redefines who is worthy of the Father's love. In verse 20, it says, he arose and came to his father. Now listen to this part very closely. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion. He's still distant. He's still a ways away. He's nowhere near to that place where he's worked his way back in to repay what he owed. He's not a servant. He hasn't even gotten to his confession. He hasn't even told him his plan of repentance. He's still a far way off, and I want to reach some of you this morning who feel that in your own life. You are a far way off from God, and you are not worthy, and you do not need a sermon to tell you that. You do not need a preacher to tell you how burdened you feel, how guilty you feel, how sorry you are. You don't feel close to God right now, and you're wondering how many times you might have to come to church as a hired hand in the kingdom of God. How many times you may have to come to him to say sorry and tell him your plan to do better next time. And here's the answer for you. While you are afar off this morning, while you're way out in the back row this morning, while you are so distant, you haven't come close to earning your way back. And you never will. And the Father's heart revealed in this story is that the Father runs. His Father saw him and had compassion and ran. Shocking to the people that heard this. The patriarch of this family. The father who had been rejected as if dead. The father whose son told him, I want your stuff, but I do not want you. And yet we get a picture of a father who is waiting and watching. And as soon as he sees the first sign on the horizon, he runs to him. And he falls on him. And he has compassion on him. That is the heart of God for every single person who has ever identified with someone who has wasted their life and wasted their resources. And you feel the burden of being afar off. This morning, God wants you to know that he sees the far off state of your soul, and he is running to you to show you his heart of compassion. That is the heart of a father. That is why we believe he is a good father, because he is so compassionate and he is so kind and he is so loving, and there is no amount of rejection. There's no amount of you saying, I'd rather have your stuff than you. You are dead to me. That he won't continue to wait for that day on the horizon where he sees you afar off and he meets you wherever you're at. This story has always been one of my favorite stories of the Bible because, like so many of you, I've identified in my own life as someone who felt afar off and wondered what it would ever take to come home. And it is for that maybe that this is one of my favorite books. As I was coming to the Lord, I read a book called What's So Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey. And I want to share with you the way that he tells this story in this book, because so often, maybe you've heard this story. Maybe you've heard about this prodigal son that's so far, and we do our best to bring it up to the cultural understanding of how shocking it must have been in that day. But I think it still sometimes falls on hard hearts because we've heard it too many times, or it's just not something we relate to. And that's why I love the telling of this, adapted for our day. And I even adapted it further. I changed some of the locations in this to make it a regional adaptation too. So not originally a girl from Idaho, but now for the hearing this morning, let me share with you something that I hope will give you a better understanding of how radical the Father's love is for every single one of us this morning. Philip Yancey starts by saying, a young girl grows up in a small, quiet town in Idaho. Maybe that's some of you. For me, that was Eagle, Idaho. For some of you, it was Meridian, no longer small or quiet. Her parents are a bit old-fashioned, tend to overreact to her nose ring, the music she listens to, and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times, and she boils inside. I hate you. She screams at her father when he knocks on the door of her room after an argument. And that night, she acts on a plan she has mentally rehearsed countless times. She runs away. In search of fortune and fame to the distant land of opportunity, Los Angeles, California, adapted for our day. Maybe some of you are living a reverse prodigal life right now, coming in from California. Welcome. We welcome you here this morning, right? Always welcoming the Californians. Her second day there, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she's ever seen, and he offers her a ride, and he buys her lunch. He arranges a place for her to stay, and then he gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She was right all along, she decides. Her parents were keeping her from the good life. And the good life continues for a month, and then 2 months, and then a year, and the man with the big car, she calls him boss now, teaches her a few things that men like. She lives in a penthouse and orders room service whenever she wants. She's adorned in fine jewelry and expensive clothes. But after a year, the first signs of illness appear. And it amazes her how fast the boss turns on her. Before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. There are no more gifts. The men are no longer wealthy. Now they are dangerous and cruel. All her money goes to support a growing drug habit. When winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on a bench outside, dark circles on her eyes. Her cough worsens. She's all alone. And one night, as she lies awake listening for footsteps, everything about her life looks completely different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a little girl. And she's lost in a lonely and frightening city. She starts to cry. Her pockets are empty, and she's hungry. She needs a fix, and then something flashes to her memory, a single image in her mind. She remembers spring in Idaho, when millions of leaves would blossom on the trees all at once. And there her golden retriever is dashing through the fields, chasing a tennis ball, and she thinks to herself, why did I ever leave? So, she says to herself, I'm going to go home. And she makes 3 straight phone calls, and they go to voicemail every time. She hangs out without leaving a message the first 2. But on the third voicemail, she says, Dad, it's me. I'm wondering about maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus your way, and I'll be there at midnight tomorrow. If you're not there, I'm just going to keep riding to Canada. And during her long bus ride home, she realizes the flaws in her plan. What if her parents are out of town? They miss her message. Shouldn't she have waited another day until she could have talked to them? Even if they are home, they probably wrote her off as dead long ago. She should have given him some time to overcome the shock, and her thoughts bounce back and forth between worries and the speech that she's prepared. Dad, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. It's not your fault. It's mine. She says the words over and over and over again, and her throat tightens because she hasn't apologized to anyone in years. And here is the moment that I hope will capture this for our day, and for some of you today, this morning. When the bus arrives, it finally rolls into the station, and a crackly voice cries over the microphone, 15 minutes, folks. That's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She checks herself in her compact mirror, smooths her hair, licks the lipstick off her teeth. She looks at her tobacco stains of her fingertips and wonders if her parents will notice, if they're even there at all. And when she walks into the terminal, not knowing what to expect, not one of the 1,000 scenes that she has played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees. There in the concrete walls of the bus terminal in Boise, Idaho, stands a group of 40 family members. Brothers and sisters and great aunts and uncles and cousins and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, and they're all there wearing these ridiculous-looking party hats, and they're blowing these noisemakers, and taped across the entire wall of the terminal reads a banner that says, "Welcome home." And then out of the crowd breaks her father, and she looks through tears and begins her memorized speech. Dad, I'm so sorry. And then he interrupts her. And he says, it's going to be okay. And then he says this, we've got no time for apologies right now. You're going to be late for the party. We've got a banquet at our house, and everybody's waiting for you. And that is the story of the heart of God to every single person who has ever felt like it's time to come home. It's time for some of you this morning to come home, and guess what? You don't have to wait. You don't have to work out your plan of retribution. You don't have to work out all of the ways you're going to pay God back for all the stuff that you stole from him and threw on the ground this morning. There is a banner in heaven that says, welcome home. To any of you who feel the burden of being gone for so long, you were created to find life in God, and you have found nothing but want in a famine land because you have done wrong. You've hurt people. You've been in horrible relationship breakups. You've broken the law. You've been to prison. You've been in jail. You haven't been to church in way too long. If we got to know what was really inside your heart, you would blush, and you're a far way off. And guess what? We are here this morning with those crazy hats and the noisemakers to say, welcome home, everybody. And now the mystery revealed. Jesus is completely redefining who is worthy. It's all written over the text. Jesus knows what people are thinking. The servant said, I'm not worthy. The scribes, the Pharisees, they say, complaining, what are you doing with these people? The answer is that there is nothing that you can ever do to make the Father love you less. And you are not worthy because of the things that you have done to throw away your life. And yet, because God is a father and not just a merciless judge, because God looks down and sees you walking home on the horizon and runs to you, you are worthy because he loves you. No other reason. But remember, this is a story of two sons. This is also a story of another way that we need to learn that we're not worthy. Because the second son represents the problem with this story. The problem with this story is how radical God's grace is. The problem is that you cannot out-sin the grace of God. The problem is that no matter how far off, God meets you still. And there's the problem with that is that there's some people that never went off, that never wasted the resource, that stayed in church the whole time. And there's a danger in there because you may not learn the lesson of what makes you really worthy, because we get all mixed up, not just in the depths of God's grace, but the height of God's righteousness. And the second son exists in this place too. Remember that there is the son of self-discovery and there is the son of moral obligation. And it is both that Jesus will meet and greet and talk to. And it is both this morning. Look how this story begins to end. Verse 25, now his older son was in the field, and as he drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come home, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he was angry. Don't you realize how offensive the gospel is? Don't you realize that the gospel not only says that sinners are received and welcomed home, it also says that people who try to be morally good miss the point? Don't you see that it says that you yourself might be angry when you compare yourselves to how much better than you're doing than everyone else? There is a danger in what we are doing. So many of us have been so far removed from our own personal homecoming, our own day of salvation, our own day when we rolled up into the bus and saw welcome home and burst out with tears and the celebration was in our name. We're so far removed that when we see that happening, we almost get frustrated. Should those people really be here? Does God really love those far off? Can it really be all of the people who aren't churchgoers? Is God's love really that radical? And if you are someone who is the older son, if you think that worthiness has to do with moral obligation and your church attendance and your scripture memorization, it's all a form of the same problem, which is this: you still want God's stuff without God. And that's exactly what we see. It says in verse 28, he was angry and would not go in. And his father came out and pleaded with him. The father pleads with the younger son, and the father pleads with the older son. And this is the danger. The moral obligation older son answered and said to his father, lo, these many years I've been serving you. I never transgressed your commandments at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I make merry with my friends. Look at all I did. I didn't transgress your commandments. At this point, Jesus is looking right at the Pharisees and the scribes. The people that are elevating themselves as the deserving, as the righteous, as the closest to God. He looks at them and says, listen to the response of the older brother. He misses everything. And it says in verse 30, as soon as this son of yours came, who devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf. You wasted the calf on him. Should have been given to me. Your stuff, all of it should be mine. Verse 31, he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. So here is the extremes of the Father's love. There's nothing that you can do, younger son, to make God love you less. And now, older son, there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. You aren't here earning more levels of God's love. You don't have to present him from how good you've been. You don't have to be angry by the way that your report card looks better than someone else, but your reward isn't any better. And here's the way this plays out for fathers. We know this. You already know this. You already know that the Father's love has so little to do with the resume, with the breakthroughs of the child's life. I had to relearn this lesson, even this week. I was at a Father's Day dinner with my family. So I was with my two brother-in-laws, and I was with my own father, and the four of us were sitting around a table, and we were eating and snacking, our own version of a feast. And my father looks at me and says, what's the proudest moment of fatherhood for you? And I thought, man, I really had to think about that, because I haven't ever really wondered what was the moment where I sat back and realized how proud I am as a father. And I thought to myself, well, I'm kind of just getting started, right? I don't know. I mean, my kids are 4 and under, so I don't have like a moment where I can say, wow, my child became an astronaut, or they went to Harvard, or they starred in a Broadway play. I don't have those moments yet. So I was like thinking, and I said, well, I don't know, what's yours, Dad? You've got kids that are grown, you got grandkids now. And he thought about it, unrehearsed. You know what he said? It was none of that stuff. See, I didn't have to wait to give my answer, because you know what his answer was? He thought about it and he said, it's probably the moment that I first saw your older sister's 10 little toes wiggling. I fell in love with her that moment, and I was proud to be a father. And then he looked at me and he said, it was probably when I looked at you and I peeled back the fold of your skin to see your face, because I was an ugly child. And he looked at me and said, I love this little guy. And he said the same thing of my younger sister. So here's what he was getting at. He didn't name any accolades. He didn't talk about me graduating college or getting married or having a child and making him a grandfather again. He didn't talk about my sister's achievements in their life. He talked about minute one. Day one. Fathers, you know the love of a father is the day you meet that child. And you're not waiting for them to learn how to obey your rules. You're not waiting for them to get educated so you can finally give them the approval and the proud father title. It's minute one. It's today. It's right now. It's their failures. It's their ups and downs. And for the older sons, that's true of all of us. There's nothing we can do to make the Father love us more, because he has loved us infinitely and without measure since the day we were born. Isn't that good news? The gospel reaches into our lives and says, I love you when you're far off and I love you when you're close. All that I have is always yours. I love you. And so who are we going to be as a church? Who are you going to be as one of these sons? Because here's the real crazy part. And I always thought this was a mistitle of the Bible, is because it always was called the parable of the lost son. And I'm always like, it's two sons. But you know what? There was only one lost son. One son was lost, as it says in verse 32. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he's found. So one son's in the feast. He's partying with a fatted calf. It really is the parable of the lost son. All along, there was one lost son. And it was, here's the danger, church. It was the people who were sitting the closest to the religious aspect of it. It was the ones who thought this made them found. This does not make you found. This is not the fatted calf. This is not the party. Jesus says, and this is the verse of the hour, chapter 15, verse 7. After the parable of the lost sheep, I say to you likewise, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner that repents than 99 persons who need no repentance. What we're here to do is celebrate the joy of the younger son coming home, and then take part for the rest of our time here, waiting to come to the grand feast, celebrating over and over and over again all the ways that God is bringing man to himself. We're going to celebrate the stories we hear of the mission team. What do you got for us to celebrate? We're going to celebrate the way that lost people have been found in your little circle. Baptism, we're celebrating the way that God has taken this church to bring more lost people found. And we want to be a church that looks like a bunch of family members at a bus station. Not a bunch of people waiting outside in anger. And that is the parable of the Father's heart. Remember, there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. Some of you, this morning, application, simple. Come home. Come back to the source of life. Come back to the meaning and the purpose of your life. God created you with a purpose. It was to know him and to live for him. You can take the stuff as if he doesn't exist, but you will find yourself in want, and you will never be satisfied until you're home in the kingdom. Come home. And for others of us, do we rejoice in the gospel, in the work of God? What we're doing now, if you are fooled into thinking that this is somehow your way to build a resume into spirituality and a righteous good works, that God will finally love you, to give you your own fatted calf, you already have everything. He's already given you everything. You were received and welcomed home to the feast of heaven, the day of your salvation, and now you already have it. Live your life in joy. Rejoice. No burden of wondering if God will finally give you a reward for your good work. He's already given you everything. Let us rejoice. And we're going to take communion now. And this is a communion that, again, this is the point of the story. The Father ran to the Son. He met him while he was a far way off. And we have a picture of that in the person of Jesus Christ. while we were still sinners, Jesus died for the ungodly. While we were, in other words, a still ways off, Jesus, with compassion, fell on our necks. He gave us his life to welcome us into his kingdom. It is the homecoming. The cross is the homecoming of your life. It is where God so loved the world that he sent his son to run into the world, to meet you wherever you are at, to take your sin, your prodigal lifestyle that had wasted your life and found you in want, and to take it upon himself so that you could be welcomed in with a celebration and rejoicing. And we celebrate and we rejoice that as we take communion. Let's stand and pray.